listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me, non-judgmental talk about infidelity with Dr. Marie Murphy. If you're looking for new perspectives on complicated relationship issues, you've come to the right place.
Days go by, they're crawling by.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Marie Murphy. I'm a relationship coach, and I help people who are engaging in anything they think counts as infidelity to deal with their feelings, clarify what they want, and make decisions about what they're going to do. No shame, no blame, no judgments. If you are ready to begin the process of resolving your infidelity situation in a way that's truly right for you, I can help you do it. There are 3 ways we can work together. You can join my secret society group coaching program called You're Not the Only One, which includes group coaching calls that are held in a way that protects your privacy, and a library of my teachings on how to resolve your infidelity situation in a way that you feel great about. The teachings are available through an online portal that you can access anytime, anywhere, for as long as the program exists, which should be for a very, very long time. There's also the self-guided do-it-yourself version of You're Not the Only One, which includes all of the online teachings, but does not include access to the group coaching calls. And last but not least, we can work together one-on-one. To learn more about all of these options, go to the services page of my website, which is mariemurphyphd.com/services. I read a quote earlier today that I really liked, and it goes like this: "The transformational work of human evolution is both super hard and super doable." I'll say that again. The transformational work of human evolution is both super hard and super doable. I don't know the source of that line. The person who sent it to me did not attribute it to anyone specific, and when I Googled it, nothing came up. Anyway, even if I don't know who gets the credit for putting those words together in that specific way, I want to suggest that this is a lovely, productive, helpful way to think about any aspects of your life that you find challenging to grapple with, including, of course, your infidelity situation. So you might say to yourself, the transformational work of resolving my infidelity situation in a way that I feel great about is both super hard and super doable. You don't have to think that it's hard, of course. But if you do think that it's hard, I want you to add "and super doable" to the end of that thought. Today, we're going to talk about fear, which is, whether we recognize it or not, one of the things that make our infidelity situations seem so hard to deal with. And we're going to talk about how, when we learn how to relate to fear, that makes the work of dealing with our infidelity situations in a way that we actually like a lot more doable. I want to encourage you to keep on listening to this episode, even if you don't think that you feel a lot of fear in relation to your infidelity situation. Or maybe even especially if you think you don't feel a lot of fear in relation to your infidelity situation. I'm going to say this in a number of different ways today, but I want to make it clear from the start that fear is a normal, and that's a word that I have some issues with, but I actually think it fits very well in this case, human emotion. Fear is a normal human emotion. Or put differently, it's a naturally occurring human emotion. And it can be really helpful to consider it an inevitable, unproblematic feature of the human experience. That's right. Fear can be considered an inevitable, unproblematic feature of being alive. And with that, it's pretty normal, quote unquote normal, and natural, and perhaps inevitable to have fears related to your infidelity situation. There are a lot of things people tend to fear in relation to their infidelity situations. For instance, lots of folks are very afraid of making the quote unquote wrong decision. Many people are downright terrified of hurting other people's feelings. Lots of us are afraid of what other people might think of us if we were to make certain choices in relation to our infidelity situation or certain changes in our lives. Many of us are afraid of how our relationships with others might change if we pursue the changes in our love lives that we want to make. For instance, a lot of people who have kids are pretty darn afraid of what might happen to their relationship with their kids if they were to make certain decisions about their infidelity situation, like leaving their other parent for the sake of pursuing a relationship with their affair partner. And then, of course, there's just the good old fear of change in general. A lot of us are very scared of change in general. And there's also the fear of the unknown or the fear of the uncertainty that might come with making changes in your life. That's a really big deal for a lot of us. And that is just a short list of things that people are often afraid of in relation to their infidelity situations. There are so many other things that we can or do fear in relation to our infidelity situation. And it's not unreasonable to be afraid of these things. And it isn't bad to feel fear, but we do want to develop a conscious relationship with fear because when we don't relate consciously to fear, things tend to happen that we don't like. And we often don't recognize the role fear is playing in what's going on. Fear is often like the silent driver or the invisible driver. And when I say that things tend to happen that we don't like when we don't relate consciously to fear, what I really mean is we tend to behave in ways that do not help us get more of what we truly want. Our actions or inactions are informed by our emotional state. And when we don't relate to fear in a conscious, intentional, deliberate way, we often end up doing some pretty weird shit, to use the most technical terminology possible. And we often don't understand why. And often, fear is driving the bus and we don't know it. And the bus is the bus of our lives. Now, what I see in my work with clients is that some people are really afraid that they're feeling fear about various aspects of their infidelity situation. Some people are like, I am totally terrified of, for instance, making the wrong decision, or I am totally terrified that my kids will hate me if I leave their other parent to be with someone else. I am terrified that if I leave my partner, I might give up on the best relationship I could have had and I'll be alone forever. Or whatever. Those are just a few examples. But the point is, sometimes we do recognize that we are feeling fear and maybe quite a lot of fear. But on the other hand, some of my clients will tell me that they're really scared about various things happening or potentially happening in relation to their infidelity situation. But then just as soon as they say the words, they'll walk it back and say something else like, well, I'm not really afraid of that. It's just something that I think about sometimes. Like, for example, people will say things like, oh, I'm so afraid of having to go through an awful divorce. And I'll say, yeah, I get it. Tell me more about what specifically you're afraid might be awful about a divorce. And they'll say, oh, I'm not really that worried about getting a divorce. I know I'd get through it. Now, my sense is that when we say these kinds of things, when we walk back our expression of fear, sometimes we're just adjusting our use of language. And that's fine. That's fair enough. It's fine to edit your statements to be a little bit more precise about what you're actually thinking. But my observation is that another thing that's happening when we say these kinds of things, part of what's going on is that we're trying to deny our experience of fear, right? That may not always be the only thing that's going on, but methinks it's often a part of it, and it's an important part to be aware of, or it's an important possibility for us to be aware of. My observation is that a lot of us really don't want to feel fear. My observation is that a lot of us don't want to admit that we are feeling fear when we notice that we are indeed feeling it. And my opinion is that this is sort of reasonable in a way because most of us don't like the feeling of fear. We don't like the sheer physical experience of that emotion, so we try to avoid having to feel it, and we try to deny its presence when we know we are feeling it. And in addition to not liking how fear feels, we also tend to think that fear means something. We sometimes think that if we're afraid something is going to happen, that's an indication that it will actually happen. We think that fear is an indicator that we indeed ought to be afraid. And we may not be aware that we're thinking this way, but when I help people really dig into their thoughts and examine what specifically they are thinking, this is often what we find. And on top of all of that, we may also think that feeling fear means something about us. There's this vague but powerful idea out there that fear is bad, or at least that it's not a good feeling to feel. And sometimes we make it mean that there's something wrong with us if we're feeling it. As I have talked about before on this podcast, we have collectively done ourselves a tremendous disservice by valorizing a certain set of emotions and pathologizing another set of emotions. We think it's good to feel happy and bad to feel sad, for instance. And fear is one of those emotions that we don't tend to valorize. We don't tend to think that feeling fear is a good thing, right? Or even an okay thing, or maybe just a routine part of the human experience that we can learn how to relate to. We collectively tend to regard fear as something to be feared, right? Nothing to fear but fear itself. Given all of that, I don't think it's all that surprising that sometimes we try to minimize or downplay or completely deny our own experiences of fear. I certainly used to deny or attempt to downplay my own experiences of fear because I didn't know how to deal with feeling fear, right? But there is an alternative. I want to suggest that it is so much more helpful to learn how to acknowledge and allow fear rather than trying to deny or resist or avoid it. And before you start to protest and say, well, I don't try to deny or resist or avoid fear, I want to suggest that the ways we do this are often pretty sneaky. For instance, if you are trying to talk yourself out of your fear by telling yourself that your fear is irrational or that the thing you're afraid of isn't something you should be afraid of, I want you to consider that even though those sorts of lines might sound rational or helpful or logical, it may be a lot more appropriate to regard this kind of self-talk as attempts to deny or resist or avoid your fear, right? If you're doing this, if you're attempting to deny or resist or avoid feeling fear, there isn't anything wrong with you. Let's be absolutely clear about that. If you're like, oh yeah, I totally do that. I've totally been trying to avoid my fear or deny my fear. You don't have to scold yourself or give yourself a hard time. But you may want to bring your awareness to your tendency to do this, and you may want to consider making an active effort to shift your relationship to fear. And although I can pretty much guarantee that being willing to be more aware of your fear and being willing to feel your fear instead of attempting to not feel it will be uncomfortable at first, I can also promise you that it will be less uncomfortable in the long run. Relating to your fear in a different way will ultimately be so worth it, both in regards to dealing with your infidelity situation in a way that you feel great about and in regards to other areas of your life as well. This might not sound very appealing. Engaging with fear, allowing fear, acknowledging fear may not sound like an appealing thing to do. It's actually great stuff though. It just requires us to contend with our own humanity or another layer of our own humanity. So, how can we develop a different relationship with fear? Well, the first thing we want to remember is that fundamentally, our emotions are sensations in our body that are generated by our thinking. I know there are other definitions of feelings or emotions that are out there in the world, but I think that one is by far the best. Emotions are sensations in our body that are generated by our thinking. We tend to make feelings or emotions into something more complex or something more complicated or something a lot more convoluted. But when we relate to our feelings with the understanding that they are sensations in our body that are created by our thinking, it becomes much simpler to relate to them. So fear, like any other emotion, when we treat it as a discrete unit of experience, is just a set of physical sensations. Crazy, right? I know. Now, the physical sensations that comprise the experience of fear may not be ones we consider comfortable, but we can learn how to skillfully tolerate discomfort. To echo what I said earlier, we tend to think that feeling fear means something bad is happening or something bad is going to happen. We tend to think that fear is an indicator that we should be afraid, but it really isn't. Fear is created through our thinking. It's the product of thoughts we have already thought. It's not necessarily an indicator that anything has gone wrong or will go wrong. Now, just to be clear, sometimes we feel fear and it's because we are registering that something is very much amiss and we're thinking that we need to react immediately. And sometimes this is appropriate. If we see a bus hurtling towards us as we are crossing the street, we may quickly think something like, oh my God, it could hit me, and then we'll feel fear. And if that's what's happening, we probably want to get out of the way of the bus as fast as we can. But our brains are also capable of thinking thoughts that produce the emotion of fear, even when there isn't an actual threat of any kind in front of us. Our brains are capable of thinking thoughts about things that have never happened and might never happen, but that can produce a lot of fear for us in the present moment. And that matters because our current emotional state, whatever it is, gives us the capacity or the propensity to act in particular ways or refrain from acting in particular ways. And when we're feeling fear, we have the tendency to do things that some people generally describe as fighting, fleeing, freezing, or fawning. Each of those things can encompass any number of very specific actions or inactions. And sometimes we really do need to do those kinds of things, right? If someone attacks us, we may want to fight back. If we're crossing the street and a bus is speeding towards us, we may want to flee as fast as we can. But sometimes those kinds of actions aren't warranted. Sometimes there really isn't much happening when we feel fear. Sometimes we're just sitting around thinking about what might happen, and there's really nothing happening in the moment outside of our mind. But when that's going on, if our thoughts are producing fear, we may still take actions that constitute fleeing or fighting or freezing or fawning within the context of our infidelity situation. Crazy, right? So important to be aware of this. And in the short term, taking those kinds of actions may indeed help us avoid or minimize our experience of fear. But taking these kinds of actions will not solve for feeling fear more generally, and probably will not generate outcomes that we like in the medium term or in the long term. So for example, if we're terrified to tell our spouse that we want a divorce because we're afraid that if we do, they might ask us, "Are you having an affair?" Feeling that fear may lead us to avoid having a conversation with our spouse in which we tell them, "Hey, I don't want to be married to you anymore." And not having that conversation will indeed allow us to temporarily avoid doing something we're afraid to do, but it also means we stay in a marriage we don't want to stay in. It also means we don't get to pursue an above-board relationship with our affair partner if that's what we want to do. And in the short term, that might not seem like the end of the world. It might even seem like a win. We may tell ourselves things like, "Oh, my marriage isn't that bad. If it weren't for my affair partner, I'd probably be happy enough in my marriage. Or at least I wouldn't feel this pull to leave my marriage. I wouldn't be thinking about leaving at all." I know some of you are nodding in recognition of your own tendencies as you hear me say this. Here's the thing. If you want to stay in your marriage, you can choose to stay in your marriage for whatever reasons you want to. It helps a lot to have reasons that you like for making that decision, but you can choose to stay in your marriage even if you're having an affair and theoretically you might like to leave your marriage so that you can pursue a relationship with your affair partner. You can, at least theoretically, make choices that contradict some of your own preferences, in other words. But consciously and deliberately choosing to stay married is very different from being afraid to leave your marriage and coming up with reasons why it's okay for you to stay married because you're too scared to leave, or because you're too scared to have the conversation that would allow you to leave. What you're doing in the latter scenario is looking for ways to avoid fear. And that's very different from intentionally choosing to stay married because you actually want to. I want you to consider that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, the reason you don't want to do something is because you think doing it will be scary and you don't want to have to feel fear or feel scared. I am not saying that that's happening all the time when you don't want to do something, but I want you to consider that it may be a thing that happens with you sometimes. And this may be an important factor in how you are relating to your infidelity situation. When we understand that the essence of the challenge we're facing is that we are feeling fear or we're afraid of feeling fear, the challenge becomes simpler to deal with. When we think that the objective nature of the challenge itself is the problem, we confuse ourselves and keep ourselves stuck. So to go back to my previous example, if you want to tell your spouse that you want a divorce, but you're afraid to do so, in part because you're afraid they'll ask you if you've been having an affair, it's fair enough to find that scary. You are allowed to find anything scary. Humans are capable of being scared of anything. Nothing is objectively scary or objectively not scary. It's our individual thinking that makes something scary to us or not scary to us. And it's okay to have thoughts that create fear. It's okay to think in ways that create fear. No fear is inherently rational or irrational. And that is one of the many reasons why telling yourself that you shouldn't feel fear because it's irrational to be afraid of whatever you're afraid of is not helpful at all. Not at all. Anyway, the steps you would need to take to tell your spouse you want a divorce aren't that complicated. You could simply sit them down and say, I want a divorce. That's what? 1, 2, 3, 4 words. You could say 4 words to them. That's not complicated. We usually think it has to be a lot more complicated than that, but it really doesn't have to be. Now, it is, of course, fair enough to want to say something other than simply, I want a divorce. But even so, it doesn't have to be complicated or difficult to come up with what you want to say and then say it. Those actions in and of themselves are pretty straightforward when we look at them objectively. It's our fear that makes them seem like they're anything but straightforward. And when we don't recognize that, when we don't recognize that we are feeling fear and we don't like what we are feeling, and we don't recognize that it's fear that's making life so complicated, not the circumstances we're contending with in and of themselves, we dig ourselves into a deeper hole and life gets harder, or at least life seems harder. So we need to be able to consciously relate to the experience of feeling fear. And there are 3 major components to doing this. The first is to be able to recognize and acknowledge when we're feeling fear. This is really simple, but it isn't necessarily easy at first. If we're not in the habit of naming and claiming our emotions, which many of us are not, and if we're at all resistant to the idea of feeling fear or to the experience of actually feeling it in our bodies, or both, acknowledging that we are feeling fear and then allowing the sensations of fear to be present in our bodies is a pretty big deal. Simple and doable, but a significant change from what most of us are in the habit of doing. The good news is we can change our habits. And if you're interested in working on changing your relationship to fear or any of your other emotions, let's work together. I can help you with this. The second thing we need to be able to do is manage our thinking about what feeling fear means in the moment we're feeling it. When we notice ourselves feeling fear, we can usefully ask ourselves, hey, am I in danger right now? Is there anything I need to do right this minute to keep myself safe from harm? Maybe there is something you need to do right that moment to protect yourself or protect others. And if there is, do that thing. If the bus is coming at you at a speed you don't like, get out of the way. But if you recognize that there really isn't any imminent danger to you in the moment, it's time to take a look at what you are thinking. Your thoughts are creating the feeling of fear. So if you want to feel less fear, you've got to get clear on what you're thinking and be willing to negotiate with your own thoughts. So to stick with the example I've been using, if we're afraid of telling our spouse that we want a divorce because we're afraid they're going to ask us if we're having an affair, and we are having an affair, and we are terrified of having to admit that, and we don't really love the idea of lying about that, or we don't think that we could even get away with lying even if we tried our hardest, we may reasonably feel some fear. And by that, I mean this kind of thinking is probably going to generate fear. Fear is the likely product of thoughts like the ones I just shared. If we want to feel less fear, we're going to have to shift our thinking. We're going to have to think something like, I can deal with this. I can deal with having this conversation no matter what questions my spouse asks me. But it may be hard to shift our thinking in that way or in any way when we're already feeling a lot of fear. When emotion is high, intelligence is low. You may have heard me say that a few times before on this podcast, and it bears repeating. When we are pretty emotionally agitated, like when we're feeling a lot of fear, it's pretty hard to slow down and say, okay, here's what's going on. I'm feeling a lot of fear. And I know that my fear is created by my thinking, so maybe I want to adjust my thinking so I can feel less fear. We just don't have the capacity to do that when our emotions are already cranked up to maximum volume or maximum intensity. So, interestingly, if we want to think our way out of our fear, we first have to be able to digest the emotion of fear enough to think clearly. And that's the third component of consciously relating to our experience of fear. We have to be willing to allow ourselves to feel it when it arises, rather than attempting to avoid it or deny it or distract ourselves from it or numb ourselves to it. And allowing ourselves to feel fear may not be immediately comfortable. Feeling fear can be pretty darn uncomfortable. But when we're willing to allow it instead of resisting it, it passes through us more quickly. And then we get to feel better sooner, right? Who doesn't want that? We're free from fear a lot sooner if we allow ourselves to feel it than we are if we keep on trying to resist it. The old saying, what you resist persists, has persisted for a reason. It's stayed around for a reason. Once you've allowed the fear to move through you and you feel less fearful, you're then able to think about how you want to handle a situation that seems scary to you and actually handle it instead of running away from it. So if the situation is that you're afraid to tell your spouse you want to leave your marriage because you're afraid they'll ask if you're having an affair, how might you actually handle that if you aren't paralyzed with fear, right? The question becomes answerable when you aren't totally terrified. You could decide that you're willing to talk to your spouse even though you feel fear, and you're just going to see how the conversation goes after you deliver your essential message. You could do that. When you recognize that the conversation itself isn't nearly as much of an issue as the fear is, this option may seem a lot more viable. But that's only one of the options available to you. You could also think seriously about how you want to handle the "are you having an affair?" question if it comes up. You could decide ahead of having the conversation how you will respond if you are indeed asked that question. And then you could decide that you're as prepared as you can possibly be for a conversation that will probably be scary no matter how prepared you are. And then you can go through with having the conversation, and you can be willing to feel scared as you do so. Because you know intellectually that fear is a normal part of the human experience. You know it's not a problem to feel fear. And you know in practice that you can tolerate the feelings of fear, the sensations of fear when you feel them in your body. And you can also decide that it's worth it to do something you find scary, even if the fear feels really intense. Our so-called lower brain wants to panic when we feel fear, which is a totally human thing, but is not super fun to experience. Fear feels bad enough, but panic on top of fear feels even worse. Our lower brain, our so-called lower brain, or our so-called lizard brain, just wants to freak out when we feel fear without questioning why we're feeling fear in the first place, or without asking ourselves whether or not we can handle feeling the fear. But we can use the so-called higher brain to respond to what's going on within our so-called lower brain. We can say, hey, okay, I see what's happening here. I'm feeling fear and I'm reacting to feeling fear. We can say, hey, okay, I get it. I'm feeling fear and I know fear is generated from my thinking. So let me see if I can identify the thoughts that generated my fear and deal with them in a considered way. We can say, hey, I may truly not like the idea of my spouse asking me if I'm having an affair if I ask them for a divorce, but I don't have to let the fear stop me in my tracks. I can digest enough of my fear, enough to think clearly, and then I can decide with my higher brain how I want to handle the situation. Here's a funny thing about how our minds work, though. Sometimes we'd rather feel certain in thinking that something really bad is going to happen and feel scared about it happening than recognize that the thing we fear might not end up happening at all. Sometimes that sort of uncertainty seems scarier than being sure that something scary might happen and feeling fear as a result of thinking that way. The things that you're scared will happen and even that you're sure will happen might not happen. None of us can predict the future. And even if they did, you might be able to handle them even if you feel some fear as you do so. Thinking this way is very different from thinking, oh, I am sure this really bad thing will happen. This is a fact. And if it does, it will be so, so awful. And I will be so, so scared and I won't be able to handle it. Anais Nin is quoted as having said, life shrinks or expands in proportion to one's courage. I think this sounds really nice. And I think that many people find this to be a good description of their experience at times. And that's fine. That's great. But I also want to point out that although some definitions of courage emphasize that courage doesn't imply an absence of fear, it means that you are brave enough to do something even when you feel fear. Other definitions of courage suggest that it means you triumph over your fear, right? And I want to suggest that sometimes we don't exactly triumph over fear or conquer fear. Sometimes we learn how to coexist with fear. I think this is a really important distinction. Sometimes we don't get over our fear. We learn how to deal with feeling fear, even a lot of fear. And maybe, depending on your interpretations of these words, maybe that could mean triumphing over fear. I may be splitting hairs a little bit here, but sometimes subtle adjustments in how we use language can be really meaningful and really helpful. What I really want to emphasize is that sometimes we feel fear and there's never a magic moment where the fear subsides completely and we feel totally confident and great. And thus we have conquered fear. And then we can do the thing that we once thought was scary, but now we are no longer afraid of. That sort of thing can happen, but it doesn't always happen. And we don't have to wait to be free of fear before we can take action. I'm going to say that again because it's so important. We don't have to wait to be free of fear before we can take action. You can be afraid to tell your spouse you want a divorce, and you can still tell your spouse you want a divorce. You don't have to try and get yourself into a state of fearlessness or a state of no fear before you do the thing you think is scary. Crazy, right? Some coaches I've collaborated with like to say that fear can come along for the ride, but it doesn't get to drive the bus and it doesn't have to drive the bus or the car or the plane or the boat or the whatever, right? So instead of saying that life shrinks or expands in proportion to one's courage, we might say that life shrinks or expands in proportion to your willingness to consciously relate to your fear. I suggest that we learn to relate to fear as something that's probably going to show up and stick around for a while every now and then, right? It may be inseparable from your infidelity situation as you know it today. And fear may come up even more often than every now and then. Some of us lean towards fear more than others do. Some of us are in the habit of thinking thoughts that generate more fear than others are. But that doesn't matter. Whether you experience what you consider to be a lot of fear in relation to your infidelity situation or only a little fear, I can assure you that learning how to deal with fear consciously is going to make resolving your infidelity situation a lot simpler and a lot easier. So often, our unacknowledged fears keep us stuck. The more that we are willing to say, okay, fear is a normal thing, and oh, gee whiz, I think I'm feeling some fear myself, the more we can work ourselves out of unproductive patterns of behavior that keep us stuck in our infidelity situations. The more we can consciously relate to our fear, the easier it gets to take action in relation to our infidelity situations that actually helps us make changes that we like. So, if you're ready to learn more about how to consciously relate to the fear you may feel in regards to your infidelity situation, please join me in You're Not the Only One. And there are two ways you can do this. You can join the self-guided version of the course, which contains my teachings in the form of videos and worksheets delivered to you in an online portal, which you can access anytime, anywhere. Or you can join the group coaching program version of You're Not the Only One, which includes all of my teachings in the online portal, as well as group coaching calls, which you can participate in anonymously. And of course, we can also work together one-on-one. To learn more about all the ways you can work with me, go to the services page of my website, mariemurphyphd.com/services. All right, everybody. Thank you all so much for listening. Have a great week. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me with Dr. Marie Murphy. Make sure to click subscribe to get updates on our latest episodes.